Market day in
Fine
Millbrook
quality.
always brought out the
Very
worst
fresh
in Mrs.
today.
Godwin's temper, and the third Tuesday of September was no exception. Sophie had run her father's stall 3 mornings a week since her 16th year, ever since her mother's fever took her and left Thomas Linden with a bakery, a bad hip that worsened every winter, and a daughter who'd inherited her mother's steady hands and her father's stubborn refusal to complain about hardship in public. She was known in Millbrook, insofar as a baker's daughter was known at all, as reliable rather than remarkable. The sort of young woman mothers pointed to approvingly and young men somehow never quite worked up the courage to properly court, though not, she suspected, for any want of interest. She had also inherited, from some source she couldn't precisely trace, a fairly settled conviction that watching someone be humiliated without doing anything about it cost more than the 10 minutes and few coins required to intervene. Sophie Linden had been elbow-deep in flour since 5 that morning, minding her father's bread stall while he rested his bad hip in the back of their cart, and she had therefore witnessed the entire unfortunate business from roughly 10 feet away. An elderly woman, plainly dressed in a gray traveling cloak gone thin at the elbows, counting coins with visibly trembling hands at Mrs. Godwin's vegetable stall, and taking, by Mrs. Godwin's evident standards, entirely too long about it. "I haven't got all morning, madam," Mrs. Godwin said, in the particular carrying voice of a woman who wanted the whole market to witness her patience being tested. "Either you've the coin or you haven't. I can't be holding up the line for every doddering old." "I have the coin," the old woman said, with quiet dignity that did nothing whatsoever to soften Mrs. Godwin's expression. "I am merely counting it correctly, which I understood to be a customer's privilege rather than a crime." "It's a crime when there's 6 people waiting behind you." There were, Sophie noted, precisely 2 people waiting behind her, and neither looked especially inconvenienced. She set down her own scale, wiped the flour from her hands onto her apron, and crossed the 10 feet of Market Square before she had entirely decided to. "I'll take her turnips, Mrs. Godwin, and add them to my own tally," Sophie said, dropping the correct coins onto the stall herself before anyone could object. "And perhaps a bit more patience for the next customer who counts her coins slowly. We all get old, God willing, and I'd hate to think what kind of welcome you'd want waiting for you at 70. Mrs. Godwin's mouth opened, found nothing adequate to say to that in front of witnesses, and closed again. Sophie took the old woman's basket, tucked the turnips in alongside what looked like a single modest loaf and a twist of tea, and steered her gently away toward the relative quiet of the church steps. "You needn't have troubled yourself," the old woman said, once they'd settled onto the steps, though she made no move to leave. "I am considerably more capable of enduring Mrs. Godwin's temper than my hands this morning might have suggested." "I don't doubt it. But there's a difference between being capable of enduring something and deserving to have to." Sophie handed back the basket. "Are you traveling far? I don't believe I've seen you in Millbrook before." "Merely passing through on my way to visit an old friend some miles north. My carriage broke an axle yesterday evening, and I've been informed it wants a full day's repair, so I find myself with rather more time in your village than I'd planned, and considerably less patience for market vendors than I'd like to admit." There was something in the way she said carriage, offhand unremarkable as though the word cost her nothing, that struck Sophie as slightly at odds with a traveling cloak gone thin at the elbows. But she had been raised by a father who considered prying into a stranger's business the height of rudeness, and so she said nothing of it. "Well, if you're stranded a full day, you might as well be stranded somewhere with decent bread." Sophie nodded back toward her father's stall. "I close up at 4. If you're still about, I'll walk you to the inn myself and make sure Mrs. Godwin doesn't get a second chance at you." The old woman's laugh was startled and genuine. "I find I would like that very much, my dear. I don't believe I caught your name." "Sophie. Sophie Linden." "Sophie." The old woman said it as though committing it carefully to memory. "You may call me Cordelia, and I promise you, Miss Linden, that today's kindness will not go unremembered." Cordelia's carriage, repaired in the end, considerably faster than the wheelwright had first suggested, once he'd properly examined the ducal crest half hidden beneath the travel dust on its door, delivered her to Rosemere 3 days later than intended, and delivered her directly into her son's considerable alarm. 3 days, mother. 3 days with no word, and I very nearly sent half the county's magistrates looking for you. I was perfectly safe, Theodore, merely delayed, and I confess I've had rather an illuminating time of it. Cordelia settled into her favorite chair by the fire with the particular satisfaction of a woman who had gotten away with something and intended to enjoy the telling of it. I was treated abominably by a vegetable seller in a village called Millbrook, on account of looking exactly as poor as I felt after 2 days on the road, and properly rescued, Theodore, coins paid and dignity restored, by a young woman who had absolutely no notion who I was and defended me regardless. Theodore, Duke of Rosemere, had spent the better part of a decade being courted, flattered, and pursued by women who knew precisely who he was down to the last acre of his holdings, and had grown, in that time, rather thoroughly tired of it. He found himself listening to his mother's account with a great deal more attention than the story of a market squabble strictly warranted. "She paid for your turnips." "She paid for my turnips," corrected a shopkeeper's manners in front of half the village, and walked me to the inn afterward to make certain I came to no further harm. All for a woman she believed to be nothing more than a stranded old traveler with trembling hands. Cordelia fixed her son with a look he recognized from childhood, the one that generally preceded her getting exactly what she wanted. "Do you know, Theodore, I cannot recall the last time anyone showed me a kindness with absolutely nothing to gain from it. Not a favor traded for a favor, not a courtesy extended because of who I am. Simply decency, offered to a stranger who might easily have deserved none of it. I find I've thought of little else on the ride home." "You want me to thank her?" "I want you to meet her and thank her, and then draw whatever conclusions a sensible man draws when his mother returns from a simple errand rather more moved than the errand strictly warranted." She sipped her tea with the particular satisfaction of a woman who had said exactly as much as she intended and not one word more. "I should like you to thank her properly, Theodore. I find I owe her rather more than the price of turnips." He rode to Millbrook himself 3 days later, with no particular plan beyond his mother's instruction to thank the woman properly, and found Sophie Linden exactly where his mother had described her, behind a modest bread stall, flour on her apron, arguing cheerfully with an elderly customer about whether yesterday's loaves deserved half price or merely a third off. "Miss Linden." He dismounted and had the distinct sense, watching her expression, that she had absolutely no idea who he was, which he found, rather to his own surprise, enormously refreshing. "I understand you did my mother a considerable kindness last week." Sophie's brow furrowed. "Your mother, Cordelia, the lady you rescued from Mrs. Godwin's temper and a great deal of counted coin." He extended a hand. "Theodore, Duke of Rosemere, for what it's worth, though I'd ask you not to hold the title against me. My mother assures me you showed her considerably more genuine courtesy than most of society manages for me on my best day, title included." Sophie looked at his hand, then at his face, then, briefly, at the very fine horse he'd arrived on, and Sophie's expression underwent the particular transformation of a woman rapidly reassessing an entire conversation. "I fed your mother turnips, your grace, and told off a vegetable seller. I don't believe that warrants a duke riding out personally to thank me. I disagree, though I confess I also came partly out of curiosity. My mother does not impress easily, Miss Linden, and she has spoken of little else since her return. I find myself wanting to understand why. Perhaps because I didn't know she was worth impressing," Sophie said, "and treated her accordingly." Something in his face shifted. Surprise, she thought, or perhaps just the particular pleasure of hearing an honest thing said plainly. "That," he said, "is precisely the answer my mother predicted you'd give." He found reasons to return, over the following weeks, that grew progressively less convincing even to himself. A query about the bread his mother had so admired, an invented interest in the village's autumn fair, a genuine and considerably less invented interest in arguing with Sophie about everything from the price of wheat to whether Millbrook's church bells were tuned correctly, which she insisted, with total conviction, that they were not. She did not make it easy for him, which he found he liked rather better than he expected to. She refused, on his second visit, to call him anything but Your Grace for the better part of an hour, purely, she admitted afterward, to watch him grow increasingly exasperated by it. She corrected his assumptions about village life with a bluntness no one at court would have risked, informing him, on one particular afternoon, that his notion of helping the village by simply distributing coin was considerably less useful than actually asking the village what it needed, which turned out to be a properly repaired mill wheel rather than charity. He returned 3 weeks later with a millwright from his own estate in tow, having apparently taken her correction rather more seriously than she'd expected any duke to take a baker's daughter's offhand complaint about infrastructure. "You didn't have to actually do anything about the mill," she said, watching the millwright and 2 of his men assess the broken wheel with the particular seriousness of men who'd been promised handsome payment for prompt work. "You told me the village needed it more than it needed my charity. I found I couldn't very well argue with that and then do nothing." He watched the millwright work for a moment, hands clasped behind his back in a posture she was beginning to recognize as his thinking stance. "Besides, I find I enjoy being told what to do by someone with no interest whatsoever in flattering me into a different answer. That's a rather unusual thing for a duke to enjoy. I'm discovering that a great many things I assumed I disliked, I simply hadn't tried in the right company." He glanced at her, something unguarded in it that she was still learning to read. "The mill wheel will be finished by Thursday. I'm told it should have been repaired 18 months ago, and that the previous request sat on my steward's desk without ever reaching me. I intend to have words with him. Careful, Your Grace. Keep this up and the whole village will start expecting things of you." "I find," he said, "that I don't entirely mind the idea." Millbrook's autumn fair arrived in October, and Theodore, whose invented interest in it had by then become considerably less invented, arrived also, dressed down enough that half the fairgoers took him for simply another well-off gentleman rather than the Duke of Rosemere himself. He proved, to Sophie's very great amusement, spectacularly bad at the ring toss, tolerable at the apple bobbing, and unexpectedly skilled at guessing the weight of the prize pumpkin, a talent he attributed, with a straight face, to years of assessing crop yields across 4 counties, which made her laugh so hard she nearly dropped the ribbon he'd won her. "You're meant to let the lady win these things, Your Grace," she told him, tying the ribbon into her hair despite herself. "It's practically tradition. I find I'd rather actually win something in your company than perform losing badly. There's enough performance in the rest of my life, Sophie. I'd like this to be one of the places I don't have to." They ate roasted chestnuts sitting on an overturned crate behind the cider stall, where no one troubled to look twice at a duke and a baker's daughter sharing a paper twist of chestnuts like any other couple at the fair, and Sophie thought, watching him laugh at something entirely unremarkable a passing child had said, that she had never once seen him look less like a duke and more like simply a man she rather liked spending an afternoon with. "You argue with me more than anyone has in a decade," he told her on his 4th visit, watching her flour a batch of dough with the same brisk competence she brought to everything. "Would you prefer I agreed with you instead? God, no. I'd find it unbearably dull." He meant it, and she must have heard that he meant it, because something in her guarded expression eased by a fraction he was beginning to recognize. "Most people who meet a duke," she said, "spend the whole conversation trying to become whoever they think he wants them to be. I find I haven't the patience for it, Your Grace, and I haven't got the time either, between the bakery and my father." "Your father? His hip," she said simply. "He can't stand a full day anymore, which means I mind the stall most mornings on top of the baking, and I don't imagine that leaves a great deal of room in my life for a duke's attention, however flattering I find it." He invited her to Rosemere itself in December, for what he called, with visible nervousness, nothing more than tea, though the reality involved a house considerably larger than anything Sophie had previously understood the word house to encompass, a butler who announced her with a formality that made her want to laugh and apologize simultaneously, and a long gallery of family portraits that seemed to watch her progress toward the drawing room with expressions she chose, for her own sanity, to interpret as neutral rather than judgmental. "You've gone very quiet," Theodore observed. Once they'd reached the drawing room, and a tea service considerably finer than anything Millbrooks possessed had been laid out between them. "I'm attempting to determine whether that portrait in the gallery of a gentleman in an extraordinarily large wig was your ancestor or simply an elaborate joke. Regrettably, my great-great-grandfather." The wig was apparently the fashion of the age, and family legend insists he was rather proud of it. Family legend is being generous. Sophie accepted her tea, willing her hands not to shake around a cup finer than any she'd handled in her life. "Theodore, I don't know the first thing about any of this. Which fork, which curtsy, which duchess I'm meant to have read about and haven't. Neither did I, particularly. The first year after my father died, and all of this became mine rather than simply the house I grew up visiting on holidays. He set down his own cup. I learned it because I had to, not because I was born already knowing it, whatever the portraits might suggest. I don't expect you to arrive already fluent in a language you've never had reason to learn, Sophie. I expect you to be exactly as stubborn learning it as you are about everything else. Word of the Duke's visits to Millbrook traveled, as such things do, considerably faster than either of them would have liked. By November, Rosemere's dowager aunts had begun making pointed remarks over dinner about suitable matches and the importance of a duchess who understood the management of a great house, and Sophie found herself the subject of speculation in Millbrook rather less kind than she'd have preferred, some of it curious, some of it openly doubtful that a baker's daughter had any business being called upon by a duke at all. Lady Cambourne, the elder of Theodore's two aunts and by far the more outspoken, cornered Sophie herself eventually, arriving unannounced at the bakery on a bitter November morning with an expression that suggested she'd rehearsed the visit at some length. Miss Linden. She surveyed the bakery's modest interior with the particular thoroughness of a woman conducting an inspection she'd already privately concluded the results of. I trust you understand that my nephew's attentions, however genuine they may currently feel, come with considerable expectation attached. A duchess must manage a household of 40 servants, host visiting dignitaries, and navigate society's more vicious currents without a single misstep. I wonder whether you've truly considered what you'd be undertaking, beyond the undeniable appeal of a title. I've considered it a great deal, actually, Lady Cambourne, mostly at 4 in the morning while I'm proving dough, which I find concentrates the mind wonderfully. Sophie kept her hands steady on the counter, though her heart was not nearly so composed. I don't imagine I'll manage a household of 40 servants the way you would. I imagine I'll manage it the way I manage everything else, badly at first and considerably better once I've been allowed to actually try. Lady Cambourne's expression flickered, something almost like respect passing briefly through it before her composure reasserted itself. You're rather more direct than I expected. I'm a baker's daughter, my lady. Directness is mostly what I've got to offer. They're saying you're only entertaining him for what he might do for the bakery. Her father told her one evening, not unkindly, setting down his cane with the particular care his hip required these days. And I'll admit, Sophie, I've wondered myself whether a duke's attention is the sort of thing a sensible woman encourages, given how these stories usually end for girls like you. I haven't encouraged anything, father. He simply keeps arriving. And do you want him to stop? Sophie did not answer that as quickly as she might have liked to believe she would, which told her, rather more honestly than she cared to admit, precisely where matters actually stood. She raised it with Theodore herself the following week plainly, because she had never yet managed to be anything but plain with him. I won't be made a duchess who abandons her father to a hired nurse and her bakery to strangers, Theodore, whatever affection I've come to feel for you. I've watched women in stories marry up and vanish entirely into someone else's grand life, and I find I have no wish to disappear into Rosemere merely because the house is larger than my father's cottage. I would never ask you to disappear, he said, and something in his voice told her he had already been turning the problem over himself, likely for longer than she'd suspected. She very nearly ended it herself that week. Drafted, in fact, a short and painfully polite letter explaining that she thought it best they cease seeing one another, that the distance between a bakery and a dukedom was simply too wide a gap for good intentions to bridge, and that she wished him every happiness with a match more suited to his position. She got as far as sealing it before her father found her staring at the envelope rather than delivering it to the post. You're not sending that, he said. It was not a question. I don't see what choice I have, father. Lady Cambourne isn't wrong. I don't know the first thing about managing 40 servants or hosting dignitaries, and I won't spend the rest of my life being quietly judged for every mistake I make learning. Her father settled into the chair across from her with the particular care his hip required, and was quiet long enough that she thought the conversation had ended. Your mother didn't know the first thing about running a bakery when I married her, he said finally. Learned it in a year and better than I ever managed myself, because she wasn't afraid of getting it wrong in front of people first. I didn't marry her because she already knew everything, Sophie. I married her because she wasn't afraid to learn it loudly, in public, arguing with me the whole way. He nodded at the sealed letter. Seems to me you've found a man who likes that about you rather than in spite of it. Seems a shame to throw it away because his aunt doesn't. She did not send the letter. She kept it, instead, in the same drawer where she kept her mother's old recipe cards, and told herself she'd decide what to do with it once she'd had time to think properly. A decision that solved itself entirely the following week, when Theodore arrived with his answer already prepared. He came to her a fortnight later with an answer that had, evidently, cost him considerable thought. Your father will want for nothing regardless of what you decide about me, he said first before anything else, laying out the terms as plainly as she'd have wanted them. I've already arranged it with Millbrook's physician, proper care for his hip, a standing arrangement, entirely separate from any question of marriage. That was never a bargaining piece, Sophie. It was simply overdue. And the bakery? Stays open under whoever you choose to train up to run it. Your cousin, I understand, has been baking beside you since she was 12 and has opinions about your bread that she's apparently too polite to share with you directly, though not, I gather, too polite to share with half of Millbrook. He allowed himself a small smile at her surprised expression. I asked around, Sophie. Discreetly. I wanted to understand what you'd actually be leaving before I asked you to consider leaving any of it. And Rosemere? The dowager aunts? A duchess who spent her mornings elbow-deep in flour. Will learn to manage or won't, and either way I find I've stopped much caring which. I did not fall in love with a woman who'd disappear quietly into a role my aunts approve of. I fell in love with the one who told off Mrs. Godwin in front of half the market and argued with me about church bells for an hour on our second meeting. He took her hand, flower and all. I'm not asking you to become a duchess who forgets Millbrook, Sophie. I'm asking whether there's room in your life, exactly as full as it already is, for one more stubborn, argumentative addition. She was quiet long enough that he began, visibly, to worry he'd misjudged the moment entirely. You've thought of everything, she said finally. Which is rather unfair of you, since I'd half prepared myself to refuse on practical grounds and you've gone and removed every single one of them. I found I couldn't in good conscience ask you to choose between me and everyone you love, Sophie. It seemed a rather poor foundation for a marriage, whatever else it might have been a foundation for. Then I suppose, she said, you'd better ask me properly, since I notice you've laid out an excellent case without actually getting round to the question itself. He laughed, a real laugh, the same one she'd first startled out of him standing beside her father's bread stall, and asked her properly, there in the bakery with flour dust still hanging in the afternoon light, exactly as plainly as she'd have wanted it asked. She said yes that afternoon, with flour still on her hands and her father watching from the cottage window with an expression caught somewhere between worry and pride, and spent considerably more of the following months than either of them expected, simply proving, to a skeptical village and a more skeptical set of dowager aunts, that a duchess could keep a market stall's accounts and a great house's ledgers with exactly the same brisk competence. Her cousin Meg took over the bakery within the year, and proved, as promised, to have rather stronger opinions about proper proving times than Sophie had ever fully credited her with. Sophie's father moved into a cottage on the Rosemere grounds close enough that she visited most mornings still, before the day's ducal business began, and complained, with real satisfaction, that his new physician fussed over him twice as much as necessary. The dowager aunts came around eventually, mostly once they discovered that the new duchess's bread put the Rosemere kitchen's efforts to shame, and requested the recipe with a great deal more humility than they'd shown in their initial objections. Mrs. Godwin, for her part, never quite recovered her composure whenever Sophie visited Millbrook, which Sophie considered, privately, one of the more satisfying small pleasures of an otherwise thoroughly unexpected life. She and Theodore married the following spring in Millbrook's own small church rather than Rosemere's grander chapel, with the whole village in attendance. The bells Sophie had always insisted were out of tune, ringing anyway with what she chose to consider an improved sound for the occasion, and Cordelia seated proudly in the front pew, wearing, at her own insistence, the very same gray traveling cloak, mended now, at the elbows, by Sophie's own hand, that she'd been wearing the day a baker's daughter decided a stranger's dignity was worth 10 minutes and the price of a basket of turnips. Lady Cambourne attended too, in the end, and was heard, by more than one reliable witness, to admit over the wedding breakfast that she had rarely seen her nephew look so thoroughly, unguardedly happy, whatever her earlier reservations about the match. She requested Sophie's bread recipe before the day was out, which Sophie considered, on the whole, a more complete surrender than any formal apology could have offered. Meg's bread, back in Millbrook, never did taste quite the same as Sophie's, a fact the whole village agreed upon and no one quite managed to properly explain, though Sophie's father insisted, with the particular loyalty of a man well pleased with how his daughter's life had turned out, that it came very near enough. The end.